Oh, hello, Alec. We're talking on a Monday as we inch closer to a final, I guess, vote count. We're still have two seats outstanding, two judicial recounts taking place later this week. One in a seat that's sort of preliminarily at least held by the NDP, and another that's preliminarily held by the Conservatives. So with the NDP at 47 seats now, it's possible they could get to 48 if they flip that Conservative seat. And I guess it's equally possible that they could go down to 46 if the Conservatives flip the other one, or more likely is they're stuck at 47. Is that kind of where we're at right now?
Yes, that's very much where we're at. It's the election that never ends. We're still very much in a holding pattern until those recounts are done at the end of this week in Surrey Guildford and Kelowna Centre. Now, it's not expected that anything will change with those two recounts, but then again, we didn't expect anything to change from Surrey Guildford being a 103 vote lead for the Conservatives on election night to being a 27 seat lead for the NDP after all the mail-in ballots and absentee ballots and everything else were counted. And so anything could happen. We could have the NDP strengthen the majority by taking over Kelowna Centre and having a 48 seats in the House. We could also have the Conservatives win back Surrey Guildford and the NDP being back down to 46 seats and needing some sort of agreement with the Greens to gain the confidence of the House. So that's all still up in the air until that happens. We won't have a cabinet. We won't have government direction. We won't really have anything. I know the NDP and Greens are still in talks about possible ways that they can work together. Haven't heard anything further on the Conservatives and the Greens. The math doesn't work on that, and I know the relationships between John Rustad and Sonia Furstenau are frosty, to say the least. But I know the NDP and the Greens are still talking. How much the NDP need to rely on the Greens will heavily depend on those recounts this week.
Okay. And how's the NDP doing in terms of identifying a speaker?
Still up in the air. And I mean, the rumors going around is that it will be Raj Chauhan again. There was some intrigue and speculation last week that, one of the Conservatives would step up, and we do know the NDP have been making those calls. It was funny. I talked to Ian Payton, who's the Conservative MLA for Delta South, and he posted. I'm mixing my days up last week, but he posted on one day that he hadn't that he was very honored to be talked about in contention for this role, but he would rather serve his constituents. And I know he was really angling to be agriculture minister. That's not going to happen now. But at the same time, I called him the next day, and he said that when he put that social media post out saying, I'm honored but don't really want the job, he hadn't actually been approached. And then the next morning, after he put out that post, he was approached by the NDP. And so that demonstrates that the NDP are still calling around. Eleanor Sturko talked to her as well. She said that she hasn't been approached. She's been included in conversations about it. She said she also doesn't want it. Same with Trevor Halford, Peter Millibar. But as she said to me, she likely knows that she knows that the NDP knows that that's not where her interests lie. And so she hasn't actually, at least last time I talked to her, been officially approached. But it looks like at this point as if it will be an NDP member who will be speaker. It looks, I can't see any reason why it won't be Raj Chauhan again. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. And that's another thing that will have to come after the recounts are finalized, because the NDP have essentially said they're not going to do anything until that point.
Okay. You did write last week, you did a bit of a head count on how many rookie MLAs we're going to have out of the 93, Alec. How many of them are newbies?
56 are newbies, which is, at least to my knowledge, a record in BC history. I mean, there's some fuzziness around 56, 57. Jody Wickens was elected, but she's previously served as an MLA, so I didn't count her as a rookie.
Right. Right.
But 56 rookies in the House, which is going to lead to potentially some headaches in terms of making sure everybody knows their roles and responsibilities and even knows their way around the House. There were several who several NDP rookies who needed help finding the bathroom. Like
Sure.
that's very much the joke, is that, the first thing you've got to learn when you enter the house is to find the washrooms, and then everything else is a piece of cake.
Well,
But
then you make sure you help, you lend a hand when you can,
yes,
Alec. You know your way
exactly,
around it.
exactly.
Okay.
But record number of rookie MLAs, and it'll be interesting to see how they deal with, all the intricacies that go into managing the house, being in the house, especially with the tight seat count. There's
Right.
going to be very little granting of leave. So normally, um, say last session, the NDP had such a large majority that it was easy enough for the NDP or BC United or even the Greens, if somebody was, sick, or their kids were sick, or they got into an accident, or something happened, family member passed away tragically, or whatever else, that they could be granted leave because, one vote wasn't necessarily going to change the math in the House. This time, the vote counts are so tight that I can't imagine any MLAs are going to be granted leave for almost any reason, especially on the government side. And so it will be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of making sure that everyone is in the House, ready to vote, and in the chamber when that vote happens. And that will come down to the caucus chairs and caucus whips, and they'll have their job cut out for them for sure.
On both sides, as you say, right?
Yeah.
Both sides are going to be struggling with that. Interesting. Okay. You mentioned coming up with a cabinet. We know traditionally, premiers do like to have cabinets that are geographically representative of the province. That could be a bit of a challenge for Eby this time around, given the concentration of his votes. What are his options outside of Metro Vancouver? Does he have many?
He has 5 MLAs outside of Metro Vancouver and Vancouver Island. So some notable names include Tamara Davidson in North Coast Haida Gwaii. She is a Haida representative, very well respected in that community, so she could very well be a name put forward for cabinet. Brittany Anderson, returning MLA in Kootenay Central, previously Nelson Creston. She was the Premier Special Advisor on Youth, and so she could be looking at a more senior position, possibly. You've got Harwinder Sandhu and Vernon Lumby, very tight race there. She's a nurse, very experienced healthcare worker in that community. So, she could be in line for that. And then you've got Steve Morissette, who's the mayor of Fruitvale in Kootenay Monashee. And you've got Randine Neal, the former Global BC anchor, who's in Powell River Sunshine Coast. And so you do have some names, and some names with people who are, I apologize for the dog in the background, but you do have some names there, but it's a very, very short list. And now the NDP were already struggling with representation outside of the major urban centers of the Lower Mainland and Victoria after the 2020 election. Even though it was a wide sweep by the NDP, it was still very heavily concentrated in those urban areas. Now, with the loss of Nathan Cullen, with the loss of their seats in Chilliwack, Langley, they're going to struggle even more to kind of have that representation. Raleigh Russell and Boundary Similkameen, another strong, big loss for the NDP. It will be a challenge to create a cabinet that represents the province as a whole. Eby says that that's something that is a top priority for him, but it remains to be seen how exactly he will do that.
And the other side, of course, when you have so many from Metro Vancouver and the island, it's hard to keep everybody happy as well.
Yes, and especially in the Lower Mainland, you've got so many municipalities. I mean, being in Victoria, we do too. We have too many municipalities here. Yeah, keeping those urban centers happy, making sure that there's the distribution between Surrey, where the NDP lost a lot of ground, and Vancouver and Burnaby, where the NDP almost swept those seats. They won all but one seat in Vancouver and Burnaby. And so it will be interesting to see how that mix happens. I imagine there will be a priority on getting people in a cabinet from places like Surrey, from places um, like Kelly Green in Richmond Steveston might be up for
Right.
a
Where they
cabinet
lost it.
portfolio as the
Yeah.
only MLA standing for the NDP in Richmond after the defeat of Henry Yao in Richmond Center and Aman Singh in Richmond Queensborough. And so it's how much do you put people in regions where you have a lot of MLAs versus putting people in regions where you might not have. Now, the last cabinet was very Vancouver focused. Um,
Right.
like you had Nikki Sharma, you had Adrian Dix, you had George Heyman, you had EB himself, you had Brenda Bailey. Even if you go over to the North Shore, you had Bowen Ma. And so it was a very Vancouver, George Chow. It was a very Vancouver focused cabinet. And it'll be interesting to see if it remains so this time around.
Right. All right. Well, still a bit of intrigue at week's end with the judicial recount, and then hopefully the dust will have settled, and we'll have our government. And then when do they plan on getting back in the legislature?
That remains to be seen. I know they're waiting until after the recounts, but my best estimate is sometime in mid to late November. They will come back into the House for a sitting. It's not a session, it's a sitting,
Okay.
meaning there will be no legislation that will be brought forward for it. At the same time, they will elect a speaker, or
Right.
acclaim a speaker, depending on if there's multiple candidates. Put forward appoint a cabinet, which will likely happen at Government House again, and possibly a throne speech. We haven't quite heard
Oh,
about.
okay.
The indication is that there's not going to be a throne speech this fall. That they're going to wait until the new year. At the same time, it could still happen. Not quite sure on that. But there will be no legislation. There will be nothing outside of a cabinet and a speaker. There'll be nothing of substance until the spring.
All right. So people can have a relatively calm Christmas, but then come the spring, they're going to be in the house day and night, I would imagine.
Yes, and now it depends on when EB wants to bring the House back. But they will need to put forward a budget. They will need to put forward a throne speech if they haven't already done that. And it's my indication that EB wants to get going with some of the policies like the grocery rebate, the middle income tax cut. Now, it's not quite clear whether they can do that without legislation or whether they need legislation to do that. There's money in contingencies they could possibly use, but that will be something to watch out for sure as we move along here.
Okay. Well, we'll watch for reporting on all of that. Thanks, Alec. We'll talk next week.
Thank you, Harold.